This is the channel where we draw on many years of university experience to provide you with reliable information on the English language and handy hints on how to improve your English. Welcome back to this introduction to foreign language teaching and learning, or foreign language education. This video is going to be about the PISA shock and the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages and the educational reforms and new educational standards that resulted from these. Now, in the last video, we saw that the OECD, since its foundation in the 1960s, has tried to define education as employability, as preparing people to be flexible citizens who are able to adapt to changes in the labour market. However, up until the 1990s, the OECD found it difficult to gain acceptance for this rhetoric of economization. Then a number of books and articles by professors of leadership and business management appeared, such as John P. Cotter's Leading Changes, which you'll find in the bibliography. Now, these books popularized the concept of change management, and the notion was quite eagerly adopted by the OECD. Change management is not based on democratic decision-making, but rather on what's called coercive persuasion, erzwungene Überzeugung. Simply put, it seeks to change people's minds by portraying a particular change as inevitable. The first step in this strategy is to create a sense of urgency. People are made to feel that the system they work in is seriously off balance, and that's exactly what the OECD did using the PISA test. The OECD started PISA in order to test the skills of 15-year-olds in reading, mathematical, and scientific literacy. The results of that test managed to send shockwaves around the world, and especially across Germany. Germany had always taken great pride in its education system, but apparently performed below the OECD average. And that shock was then used to initiate change by means of techniques based on research in brainwashing, as Silja Graupe points out. These techniques include group pressure and authority, but also winning the support of employees by giving them a certain degree of participation in the process of change. Resistance to change management is described as pathological. In other words, if an employee, or in our case a teacher, refuses to cooperate, they are systematically silenced. In the process of change management, there can only be constructive, positive criticism, which has already embraced the goals of the organizational changes in question. Critics are not allowed to call the changes themselves into question. If you do that, you're cast as a troublemaker. So it was this coercive persuasion that allowed the OECD to eventually begin the transition towards a new model of education, a transition that it had been aiming at since the 1960s. In language teaching, this transition was facilitated by an initiative which was called the European Framework of Reference, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, or CEFR for short. The CEFR seeks to establish common standards for language teaching and language testing across Europe. Now, here's a quote that illustrates quite well the kind of thinking behind PISA. Wenn sich ihre Leistungen 25 PISA-Punkte verbessern, würde die deutsche Wirtschaftskraft langfristig 7,3% steigen. Das sind rund 14 Billionen Euro für den Rest des Jahrhunderts. What is captured in this statement is the well-known relationship between a country's level of education and economic growth. At the same time, however, it's a statement that is meant to give credence to a number of underlying premises, a sort of hidden agenda that is rarely openly discussed. The first premise is that the reason why we have schools is because we need to create economic growth. All of education revolves around economic growth, and everything in life is economic. The second premise is that we do not need a democratic discussion of what education is for. It's preordained that education is about making more money. The third premise is that a richer society is a better society. Now, I'm not saying that all of this is contained in this short statement, of course, but it's the underlying logic of the PISA system. So PISA is basically an undemocratic and utilitarian approach to education. It's undemocratic because it's the people who should decide what education is about, not economists or the private interests of entrepreneurs. It's utilitarian because it implies that all human decision-making is about the rational weighing of advantages and disadvantages to determine policy. It's a grave attack against human dignity and justice. So now we might ask, of course, why is PISA so effective then in influencing public opinion? Well, one reason may be that it uses a lot of numbers and rankings. And this allows educationalists to reduce a complex educational reality to a few apparently quite simple figures, numbers. Now, if you think, why bother? I'm going to be a civil servant. I don't care much about political debates. Well, you've got another thing coming, because the economic logic I've just been describing may lead politicians to decide that language teaching can be dispensed with. We have apps that translate much better into foreign language than 99% of people. So you should be bothering a little bit at least. So this raises at least 4 questions. What did the PISA results really reveal about the German education system? What were the changes that were implemented in the aftermath of the PISA shock? Third question, have the changes in any way improved the system? And the last question, should the changes turn out not to be justified, how can we resist them? So what do or did the PISA results really reveal about the German education system? Well, the study does reveal a number of things about differences between students with respect to gender and social background, for example, but it tells us next to nothing about actual student achievement and the causes of such achievement. There are several reasons for this. One is that PISA allows no conclusions to be drawn about what governments should do to improve education, because it doesn't tell us anything about the factors that influence performance. We can only speculate on these factors, and these speculations often turn out to be wrong. To take a simple example, when Finland topped the PISA rankings in 2000, 2003 and 2006, a lot of people claimed that this was due to its comprehensive school system, individualized teaching, and the idea that teachers are facilitators in Finland rather than providers of knowledge. That teachers are not like the conductor of an orchestra, but rather like a friend who occasionally offers a few handy tips. Now, in recent years, Finland has fallen back somewhat, and the rankings are dominated by Korea, Japan, Singapore, and other countries. The problem is that these countries do not quite follow the same model as Finland, or the model that Finland is supposed to follow, at least. Rather, they have a very strict teacher-centered and performance-oriented system. Now, what gives the whole story a slight twist of irony is that it later turned out that the excellent results achieved by Finland were due to the old authoritarian Finnish system, which was slowly decentralized from the mid-1980s onwards. Finland owes its economic rise in the 1980s and 1990s, and this is what the OECD wants to achieve, of course, economic growth. So Finland owes this economic rise to its traditional school system, not to any form of modernization. In this traditional system, teachers had great authority and a very high social status. The work ethic and discipline are excellent in Finnish primary and secondary classrooms, and this allows good teaching and learning to be achieved. Teachers insist on quietness while the teacher is speaking, and there's a lot of frontal teaching. Pupils are taught to respect each other. In primary schools, a cuddly toy is given to a pupil, and this allows only that pupil to speak in the discussion circle. The other pupils listen in silence, they clap and wait for their turn to speak. What's also interesting is that Finnish teachers work fewer hours than German teachers, and that most Finnish schools operate half days. But those differences have been conveniently swept under the carpet by the OECD. Now, for further discussion of the problems associated with PISA, I'd like you to read chapter 2 from Jochen Krautz's book, Wahre Bildung. As we will see next week, there are literally hundreds of factors that influence learning outcomes, which Hattie 2009 has identified and which we're going to look at. But I can already say that the most important factor is not the school system, but the individual teacher. So a factor that is, if you like, much closer to the learner than the school system. Also, if you don't look at the data as a whole, there are huge differences between federal states and individual schools. Also, every time international assessments like PISA are released, we hear about these high-performing East Asian economies. Yet what comparisons find is that the reasons why East Asian children excel are cultural and hence beyond the control of education systems. And so what PISA 2012 really teaches us is that parents and familial culture matter a great deal. So what's all the fuss about? It's probably true to say that PISA was simply a strategy thought up by the OECD to initiate change management with the aim of establishing new educational norms and defining education as being able to apply very basic skills to a variety of situations. Now, the second question I wanted to ask is, what are the actual changes that were implemented in the wake of the PISA shock? Now, since you've grown up in the system, you probably know it quite well, but you don't know the rationale behind it. Here we must distinguish between changes that apply to the education system as a whole and foreign language teaching in particular. So let's start with the general changes, which are quite nicely captured in this diagram. We're dealing with a kind of cybernetic model, a control loop, in German Regelkreis, that is normally used to manage and control artificial systems, such as heating systems. The OECD is the major change agent, which has been using the PISA test to exert pressure on the media, the general public, and the government. In Germany, the government of each Land and the Kultusministerkonferenz, the Standing Conference of Education Ministers, then established new educational standards which are set at a particular level. And it's this set point that the heating system, in this case the school and its teachers, are expected to aim for. Whether they do achieve it is measured by the output of the system, which can be likened to the temperature in a heating system. And this output is measured by means of standardized tests like PISA or VIRA. And the feedback produced by the output then leads to readjustments within the system. Now, I've got a group work assignment for you here on this cybernetic model. I'd like you to answer the following questions. What are the implications of applying such a cybernetic model to the education system? What role does the model attribute to teachers and school principals? And what can it tell us about the quality of the teaching methods employed? Within the system, students are expected to acquire competencies rather than knowledge or education. I've already hinted at what the difference is in the first video. There are many different formal definitions of competence, and I'm going to put a link here to a video by a German educationalist who explains the various traditions quite well. As for language competence, the CEFR subsumes knowledge, know-how, ability and skills under the heading of competencies, and thus distinguishes between 4 types of general competencies. Declarative knowledge, savoir in French, knowing what, including socio and intercultural knowledge. Know-how and skills, savoir-faire, which includes socio and intercultural know-how. Existential competences, savoir-être. This is about personality traits, points of view and attitudes, and the ability to learn. Savoir-apprendre, learner strategies, metacognitive awareness, we'll learn later what that means, and media literacy. And then, of course, there are communicative language competences, which you might be more familiar with already from your school days. Linguistic competence about language structures and how to use these, and this is about traditional vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation and intonation. Spelling, what we conveniently call sprachliche Mittel in German. Then it's about the receptive skills of listening and reading and productive skills of speaking and writing. And there's also the interactive skills and the skill of mediation, which is basically the same as translation. Now, this brief overview tells us that the Bildungsstandards, the educational standards, disregard Bildung in the sense of personal growth and self-cultivation, which we looked at in the last video. Bildung is redefined as key competencies, in our case key linguistic skills, that enable the individual to adapt to economic requirements. Although some of these competencies appear to mention personality traits and attitudes, what they mean is that these attitudes, emotions, etc., are to be harnessed as resources, as human capital that allows economic growth. So there's a danger here that if the model is applied strictly, that pupils are just taught to the test, as we say. Teaching to the test means that pupils or students are taught the skills they need to pass a particular test, but nothing else. And teachers are usually quite concerned about tests because they don't want to incur the reproach that they don't adequately prepare their students for these tests. For concrete evidence that no content is taught and no thinking is required to solve Abitur tasks, we needn't look any further than our own Land, our own federal state of Lower Saxony, and the 2019 Abitur tasks. There are 2 tasks. One involves what is called mediation, which is another term, as I've just said, for functional translation. The other task is a listening comprehension task about a radio program comprising 11 items on a multiple choice test. So even the choice of tasks reveals that neither of the 2 tasks requires any cultural or other previous knowledge. The content is more or less completely random. What counts is the ability to translate or to understand a random piece of text in English. The mediation task is a simple German newspaper text about simultaneous interpreting at the European Union headquarters or the European Parliament. The students need to extract bits of information from the text and rephrase these bits of information in English. There's no need to write a coherent text or make a case in the foreign language. So far, so bad. Let's look at the listening task in a little more detail. So please stop the video at this point to look at the listening task. which I've put a link to here. Now you'll have noticed that out of the 11 items, 10 are straightforward items of the type that require no thinking, no inferences, but a simple reproduction of the content of the radio program. Only one item, item 11, is claimed to require students to recognize implicit information and its implications, but even that is highly debatable. So to sum up, what these tasks illustrate is that firstly, there is no longer any need to demonstrate thinking skills or cultural knowledge in the English Abitur. Content is random, so we just talk for the sake of talking and listen for the sake of listening. Competence orientation separates language from the world, which it's supposed to describe or influence. Secondly, all this technocratic approach wants is for learners to be able to cull information from a source, to tick off items or to fill in worksheets. It reduces the learner's role from that of an active thinker and an active communicator to that of a compliant reproducer of what others have said. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, this approach requires no previous knowledge. Having looked at the sample Abitur tasks, it's fairly easy to answer our third question. Have the changes or the reforms in any way improved the system? As I've been arguing in some detail, the answer for language teaching is a clear no. As for other subjects, the most cautious answer here would be that we don't know. The argument put forward by the reformers, they often called Bildungsforscher here in Germany, their argument is that the proposed reform has strengthened our country's position in the ranking lists, and this lends legitimacy to the reforms. However, if we compare, for example, Germany and Sweden, we can see that both countries have been carrying out reforms, but with differing success. Germany has improved its position, while Sweden has been slipping in the rankings. So there's no real causal connection between results in PISA tests and reform measures on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is no link between reforms and improvements in results. But still, people continue to use PISA as an argument in favor of reform. A less cautious answer could be based on a comparison of student achievement in the late 1990s and the early 2000s versus the period 2015 to 2020. Practicing teachers will tell us that standards have dropped, and this is also evident from attempts by governments to simplify tests and to award increasingly high grades for the same achievements. An extreme example is Berlin, where in 2016, 14 times more 1.0s were awarded than in 2006. We've now found that the changes initiated by the OECD and the CEFR are not justified. They're not about education in the true sense of the word, and they only measure very basic skills. Now, I've got nothing against basic skills, of course. Who could be against basic skills? But we need to go far beyond them. Jochen Krautz suggests 3 measures that will help us to oppose and resist the economization of education, and I've added a few of my own to these. First suggestion, we should stop reforming the system now. We need no more reforms. The individual university educated teacher and the individual school is at the center of a good school system, and what individual teachers do has the greatest impact on teaching. Teachers should follow the principles that evidence-based classroom-centered research, classroom research, has found to be most effective, not general nationwide tests such as PISA. We'll learn about those in the next video. We should not reject everything from the past. That's the second lesson we can learn, just because it's from the past. Many of the old methods and much of the old content that some of your teachers may still have been using are very effective. Third point, we should stop worrying about tests and teaching to the test, and we should aim for higher levels of achievement than those required by tests. Fourthly, we should use more direct, goal-oriented teaching, not necessarily frontal teaching. That's also something we're going to learn from John Hattie in another video. We should speak out openly, that's the fifth point, we should speak out openly against the OECD's change management. It's against democratic principles, and it's for us to decide, for the people to decide what sort of education we want. The sixth point is that we should practice a type of education that requires knowledge and skills and that promotes critical thinking skills, not just empty competencies. Acquiring knowledge and skills is a process that inevitably requires a lot of effort. So in language teaching, for instance, this means acquiring vocabulary and grammar, and that's hard work. It can't be avoided. It also means doing as many form-focused activities as meaning-focused activities. That's something we're going to talk about later in this course. And finally, we should only mark work that can be clearly ascribed to an individual student. Now, here are some bibliographical references you might want to check out. And please also do the compulsory reading for next time, which is chapter 2 from Jochen Hart's Wahre Bildung.